So today, this little segment, I'm going to be actually talking more for Blender developers, people who are interested in bringing updating capabilities to their add-ons. So it's a common thing where Blender users, we have all these add-ons, some are built into Blender, many we get from various places in the web, and once you install an add-on, it's a problem where you never know if it's being updated unless you're explicitly sort of manually following that project wherever it may be. So I worked with CGCookie over a course of a few months to help develop what we're calling the Blender add-on updater, which is a Python module that developers can include in their add-ons in order to provide an in-Blender experience for being able to check for updates at a click of the button and being even able to install those updates all directly within inside of Blender. So one of the caveats to that is we all know and are looking forward to the Google Summer of Code project. There's been a few attempts in the past trying to create a more global Blender updater sort of repository, so something like a package manager that could work for all add-ons. But until such a solution is in place, or if you always want your own sort of custom implementation, this gives an avenue to allow you to have full control over how your own updating system works in your own custom sort of experience. So what I'm going to do in the first part of this call is just kind of demonstrate what it looks like. You don't have to be a programmer to understand and appreciate that. And then even if you have only dabbled a little bit in add-on development, or you have like a repository that is stale or something, I'm going to go over how to actually implement the updater into your own add-on. And it's pretty straightforward. There's a few steps, but that's the plan for today. Sound good, everyone? All right. So I will start by sharing my screen. Hopefully you can see it coming through now. But what I have up here is the actual page for the updater itself. I can zoom in a little bit. So again, it's under the CGCookie's GitHub link. It's so github.com/cgcookie/blender-addon-updater. And in here, you can directly download the source code. And obviously there's lots of documentation and so forth. But I'm just going to jump into Blender and kind of show you what it looks like so you don't just like look at code the whole time. So if I go over here and just quickly open up Blender. So I've already installed it on my machine. I will also actually increase the DPI so that we can see it a little bit nicer. Maybe 100. Let's go for that. Yeah, so if I go into add-ons, I've already installed it. But I can give a brief demo of what it looks like essentially. So when you enable the demo add-on, so this is both the source code for the updater as well as a demo add-on in one piece. You can see how it's implemented. But when I enable this is what it looks like. Most of the UI is kind of implemented in the user preferences section, but obviously you can place it essentially kind of wherever you want. But the basic functionality is you have the ability to check for an update. So if I were to press this button here, you would see it shows that it's checking for an add-on, and then once the UI refreshes, it will actually say you're already up to date, or there's a new version to be installed, and so forth. And it's done using background and threading, so it doesn't hang the UI at all, which is really nice. But you see here, I've clicked the button, it says it's already up to date. That's just because I downloaded it from the master repository. But perhaps I know there's a target version that I want to install. So I can actually use this little pop-up here to select a different target to install. So I can, for example, go back down to version 1.0.1. So I can press OK. It will then actually download the repository in the backend and then place it in the right files. And you can see now I get this pop-up after I press to install that version saying success. I obviously can't undo this. And you now need to restart Blender just for stability reasons. So if I restart Blender now, and just reopen it up here. If I were to go into my updater code, you would note that it now reflects the version 1.0.1. And again, let me fix my system size there. If I were to then press check for update now, it would actually tell me that, yes, in fact, there is an update. I can now update up to version 1.0.2, which was the one that we downloaded directly from the website. And so that's great. So I could do that again, and it works exactly the same way. I also have the ability to restore a backup. So let's say that something was wrong with the latest version of the code, or maybe your user tried to update to the newest version, but something didn't go right, or maybe that version is incompatible with their system for whatever reason. They're like, I want to go back. Obviously, they could also, press the reinstall version, or if you're a developer or for whatever reason have local modifications, you can just press restore from backup, and it gives you the date of when that backup happened. So that's all very nice and very stable system. There is also the ability to auto check for updates. So for example, if you just want to, not worry about going to the user preferences, because obviously this is supposed to be kind of like a push sort of experience, wherein if there's an update, it will tell you about it. You don't have to search for an update, because that kind of defeats the purpose of you being able to have it kind of work for itself. So you are able to enable auto check for update, and then it provides some options for, how frequently do you want to be updated. Settings like every hour or minute are probably mostly for developers or for testing purposes. But essentially, you can set these once you save user preferences. I will make an example of just doing it for, let's say, a minute. If I save my user preferences, and then let's see, we see that it says 11/12/28. So note that the last check for update here was 11/12/28, and I've saved my user preferences. I'm just going to note that when I quit Blender and restart my instance, we should find that it will automatically check for an update for us. And as soon as I open Blender, you notice what pops up. Update ready, press OK to install version 1. And I guess the window gets a little bit cut off, which you can modify, of course. But essentially, it now allows us to update as soon as we open Blender. And it's a non-disruptive interface. This sort of updating little window will only appear at the moment you open Blender, and it will at most only check once per instance in your Blender add-on. So that's the overview of the updater. It works very nicely. You can see right now I just pressed OK, and without even going to user preferences, I've already installed the update. If I were to quit and once again open Blender, we would find that it's already up to date. And again, just to prove it, I can go to the updater, and you see that we are back on version 1.0.2 with all these great things. So that's the overview of the add-on updater. Again, the goal is really just to give power to the developer to implement their own updating system, to communicate to the users, to make sure things are available, and actually keep software up to date on your user systems without them having to worry too much about following the developer themselves. So the next sort of 15 to 20 minutes, I'm going to talk more about how to actually implement this into your own code. Again, it's pretty tailored. There's a pretty detailed tutorial already out there, so it's not too hard, but I'll walk through the steps here. So the basis of how this is implemented is actually through GitHub and GitHub releases. So if I jump over to the add-on updater, just kind of overview of how it's actually working. The way it's set up right now is it actually utilizes releases on GitHub. So if on GitHub I go to the releases section here, you can see that we have a few updates here. We have some change logs and we have versions, but the endpoint is that we have these, they're called tags essentially. So if I press on tags, you can see the versions that we were seeing in the UI verbatim. So we're essentially utilizing the GitHub API to actually pull down these updates. Now that's how the base implementation of the add-on updater is configured, but we have included modules and methods to pass in your own sort of code checking or repository checking functions you can insert, such that if you don't use GitHub, you can sort of modify it for any other system. And that's dependent on whatever system. You could locally host your own code, have it on your own website, and download versions and so forth, as long as you kind of have your own API to do that. Again, that's more advanced, of course, but if you're using GitHub at the very least, and in the nearest future, something like GitLabs or Bitbucket, you're able to just use releases, which is a built-in function with GitHub. But nonetheless, if you are on this repository and you're looking to go into the tutorial, there is a button right here. Just want to point that out. So if you want to implement this in your code, that will bring you out to the website, which is where I have the longer text tutorial of this. But again, like I said, I'm going to walk us through this process directly on this presentation. So to prove that it sort of works with any zip-based structure add-on, I'm actually going to start by loading one of the templates from inside of Blender. So if I go to the text editor and simply open up, for example, the add-on add object, That's a classic template built-in add-on. What I then need to do is save this out as a text file. I'm going to create a folder in my desktop. I'm going to call it Addon Updater Demo. Pretty sure that doesn't match my other file name. Yep, that's good. And I'm just going to save it here. I'm going to save it as a init.py. So the one note I will say is that because you're having additional files to include to create this updater, this only works for add-ons that are in the structure where you install it by using a .zip structure. So it does not work if you have just like a .py file to install. You could theoretically just copy paste the contents of the source code all into that one file. But this is more intended for the little larger add-ons that have multiple files broken down. But nonetheless, if I press save here, I then have saved my add-on, and that's great. And next we have to start essentially placing in the piece of code that we need. So to do that, first, obviously the first step would have been to download the zip of the file itself. And then after you do that, you'll have it on your desktop as a zip file, of course. That would be this guy here, the master. And so the very first step is to directly copy paste over these two files. It's Addon Updater Ops and Addon Updater. To briefly explain what these two are, the Addon Updater.py, that is essentially the source code, the very base backend system that does all of the handling of the threading and the checking to the GitHub account and doing all that sort of processing stuff. The Addon Updater Ops.py file, that is what implements all the UI. That does the pop-ups, it does the background, when you start a check and it does the background, it does that layout you see in the user preferences, as well as in the that demo panel we saw in the 3D view. And so this ops file is technically something you can modify. You could even theoretically not use it all and completely use the raw direct connections to the Addon Updater and implement your own UI. But they are decently tightly coupled, so as a starter, the most easiest thing to do is to take this file, copy it, and then if you like, modify it however you want. But the idea is you never should have to modify the actual Python module, which is the Addon Updater. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this into our demo file over here. And then essentially we're going to start actually implementing and bringing the code into our repository. So I'm going to open up this file here. I'm actually going to use a different text editor just because it's a little bit more convenient to work in. This is Sublime Text versus the Blender editor. Obviously you can do this all in Blender or any text editor. We're just copy pasting code from one location to another essentially. So over here I have the raw file that this is the add-on we just extracted from Blender essentially. So this is the exactly as it was from Blender. So nothing else fancy is going on here. And then we have our updater file and our updater ops file. All right, so the next step would be essentially to start importing our module. So what you first want to do in our init file is import the ops code, essentially. So the way this works is essentially we will do import from the local file. So dot from local file, import Addon Updater Ops. So what this does is it actually will import this module, the ops file, into this file here. Then the next step is we need to add this to the register section of our add-on. So where we go to do that is down in the register function. All we have to do is Addon Updater Ops and then register. And it's a little bit different from how we're registering other things. We're actually going to pass in the BL info. This is because this is how the add-on will actually grab the version of your add-on to make sure that it matches the user interface. So to do that, I'm just going to copy in the BL info. And again, all these steps are very clearly outlined in the text tutorial. I'm just going through them so you can see them quickly this way. And so at this point, you essentially have done the very base most configuration. This would work as it is right now in the sense that you have registered it. It shouldn't have any errors, but obviously we haven't configured it yet. So the next step would be, now that you've added it into the base add-on, you've imported it, you're registering it, we now need to jump into the ops file and configure it for our specific example. So if I jump into the ops code, and then one of the very first things that you're going to want to do is jump all the way down to the end of the file, all the way down, and you'll see there's a bunch of settings here. So there's lots of ways you can configure this updater code. One of the ways would be to, for example, only allow to notify the user. Don't provide an option to directly install and download. So let's say you don't distribute your code through GitHub, for example, and you just want to notify the user that an update's available. You could throw up a completely empty Git repository and only have versions there, and then in the version releases have links to your website, for example, and that would still allow Blender to give you the option to notify your user an update and provide like a button to click to download manually, and it would bring you to your website or whatever custom page you want it to be. So that functionality is all possible. So you're not tied to using the ability to auto install if you're not using GitHub as it is right now. But the base level sort of implementation would be to obviously have the updating and have the actual code on GitHub. And in order to point to that account, this is what these two items here are. So the first one is we're setting what's called the updater.user equal to CGCookie is the default, because that is the actual source username for this GitHub repository. And then updater.repo, that is the repository name. And just to kind of dispel where this comes from, if you go back to our GitHub page, you can see that exactly matches essentially the URL breakdown of the actual repository. And that's how the GitHub API works. So obviously, you would want to customize this for whatever your specific case is. Again, just go to whatever repository you might want, and then just copy the structure of the username and then the actual repository name there in for these variables. In the meantime, in this sort of like demo example, I'm just going to directly copy and paste these values over into our own custom ops file. So I'm going to leave these the same essentially, so it'll work as it is. It's a little bit cheating. But the idea is you would customize this to whatever you want. So the next step would be to change the add-on or the updater.addon parameter. So this is actually all the way at the top of our file, and that is this guy here. So I could, for example, name this whatever I want. So demo updater, or maybe I'll do add object updater. Because that's the name of the base add-on we used, was the add-on add object. Just to explain what this is a kind of a quick way to very easily set the BLID names for all of your classes. You'll notice that for each class that's defined in this interface code, you have addon.updater or updater.addon at the beginning. So essentially what this means is that you're going to have a standard class module so that each operator that's automatically registered with this file will be unique. Because obviously if you have multiple different developers using the add-on updater code in their repositories or in their add-ons, and they all use the same exact class code and operator names, it won't work. They kind of clash, they'd overlap. So it's very important that you set this value here. Note, you could manually do this and directly update by, for example, if I just wrote add object updater here throughout this file. Obviously that's very tedious and that's an annoying thing to do, so instead we have this sort of convenient thing that's up here, but it's very, very important that's kind of registered at the root level, not inside a class or definition before any of the other classes run, so that this variable is set even before we get to the first class definition. So that's why this is kind of in a weird location, but it is very important to do. So once we've set that value to our custom thing, the next step would be to actually add in the preferences section to our add-on. So the way we could do that is if we go over to our init file here, it happens to be that this add-on, which we had, didn't actually have a preferences panel yet. So we'd actually want to be creating our preferences even if it just has the add-on updater itself. So we can do that by first essentially creating this class here. So class, let's say demo preferences, and then bpy.types.addon preferences. This is just standard Python code for allowing you to actually create a preference panel. Again, a preference panel is it's exactly this here. It's in the user preferences area. It's this area below the documentation report bug and remove button. This is your custom local space for every add-on where you can just draw whatever you want that are settings relating to your add-on. So in this area, we're going to basically import or utilize a built-in function for actually drawing our updated code. So first, obviously, you need to have your draw self and context. This is the draw function for your preferences panel. Let's do like layout.self.layout. And, what am I doing? It's early, I guess. So then all we have to do is we've already imported the updated code, if you recall. So it's this updated code here. So you already have links to this. If you were in a different file, for example, if you implement your user interface in a different location, you would just need to make sure that you do this same line import. And then all you have to do to pull in the sort of default UI is simply run its add-on updater ops. Again, this matches what we have up here. If we did it like as something, something else, then you would, use something else. But again, the easiest is just to copy this. So add-on to updated ops, and then we want to do update settings UI. And so this is the actual function that will draw code onto your interface. And you can do self and context. And so this allows you to basically auto place in where you want this UI code to be. So I don't technically have to run this inside of user preferences. It just makes the most sense because that's where it's configured. But you can run this function in any panel or interface and actually draw the same code. So it does give you that level of flexibility. All right, so the next step is you actually want to copy over all of the properties that are used, or the preferences. So if you recall, you have in the user preferences all these options, these checkboxes, these values, most of these items up here. You do have to add that code into Blender. And so the easiest way to do that is, again, if you go to the tutorial or onto the GitHub page itself. So it'll actually provide you options to copy those parameters. I'm going to copy directly from the tutorial itself just because it's easiest. So essentially, I'm scrolling down. At this point, we're on we're just past step 6. We're on 7, where we're just copying the properties. You can just copy these over verbatim. You don't have to modify them at all. So I'm just going to directly copy these here. And then when I go back into this demo preferences panel, we essentially just want to define these properties, these Blender properties, at the class level of this preferences panel. Also, I noticed that's not how you name Python functions. You don't have spaces in the name of classes. All right, so I'm going to just paste these directly in here. I noticed that my indentation was just off 1 level, so I'm just going to fix that real quick. Thank you, Sublime Text, for that functionality. And here we have all of our settings that are necessary for the file. And I guess that's a good point. I even have a little tip for myself. If you were looking at the original repository, obviously, again, from the GitHub repository, from the demo add-on, you obviously could just directly copy it from here as well. That would also work. You could copy this whole thing if you don't have a preferences panel, actually. But I'm trying to not use the demo to help create the demo. But anyway, so here you have defined all your preferences, and you now have the drawing of your actual code here. And so we're pretty much done at this point, in fact. So if I were to save all this, again, make sure you save, very important. And then I go over and, I don't know why I named it almost exactly the same thing, but say compress name. And let me give it a little bit more of a unique name for our add-on. So updater test new object is what I'm going to call this, just so I can easily search for it in the UI. We should find that after we compress this into a zip folder, because again, that's the structure for these add-ons. So it's a zip folder in Blender. I should now be able to install this file on the desktop, and we called it, thought I called it something else. No, add-on updater. Yeah, it's this guy. If I install this, you see that it comes up. Yep, updater test new object. And fingers crossed, we shouldn't have any errors when we enable this, hopefully. And we do, of course. All right. It looks like there was an issue with the way I was defining my preferences, so just give me a quick moment to fix however I was doing that. Let's see here. Apologies for this. Just make sure I copy. I didn't really define my preferences properly. So I forgot you have to define the BL ID name for your preferences, of course. So I'll just put this code in here. Again, this is standard for any preferences interface for any add-on. You have to make it equal to the package of the add-on itself. That's just how it functions. Let's try that again. So delete this. We're going to compress it. Oop, I do not want to put it into a CD. That's not how you install add-ons. Inserting a CD into Blender will not work whatsoever. All right. And I'm just going to close and reopen Blender just because sometimes modules don't reload. So let's just do this again. And we're going to install the zip file we just created. Again, it was the add-on updater demo. When I do this, again, fingers crossed again. What's going on here? No, I'm not sure what's going on. Again, I'm just going to kind of just steal from our... Okay, all right. Obviously, the idea is you would have already had a preferences file. Obviously, I haven't registered my my preferences file here, so that would be an important thing to do, obviously. So again, I'm just going to just directly copy from the source file. We have to actually register the preferences class, of course. So again, all just standard stuff for the preferences that I just am not even really paying attention to. So we register the demo preferences file here. And then, again, I'm just stealing from the source master code of the repository. I'm going to copy the unregistered class over here. And so then I'll stick this into the unregister, and now we should be good. All right. Again, apologies for that. But now we should be good to right-click, compress. It's now called to, which actually is probably not the best thing to do. We're going to do that again. Again, I'm just going to refresh Blender real quick. And then going into user preferences, we've already deleted it, so I'm just going to install it again from the desktop. And we should have third time's the charm, right? Is that how that works? And no errors. And now when I expand it, we see all the updater code here. Isn't that great? And if I press check for update, voila, we can now update to version 1.0.2. Now, if you're scratching your heads like, how can we update? Again, remember, we pointed this towards the existing repository over here. So obviously, it thinks it's this add-on, and it says it's looking at the fact that we have version 1.0 installed and saying, hey, version 1.0.2 is actually the more recent version that you could use, for example. So if you were to live point it to a different repository, so just for the sake of proving that example, I'm going to point to this other add-on I've developed and try and re-show that in the interface. So again, if I just jump into our ops code, and then if I just change the username to my GitHub username, which is the duckcow, and then change the repo to be mcprep, if I were to compress and install this again, it would show me different options. All right. And I realize they're getting a little close to time here. I'll use the next 4 minutes still, though. So if I install that there, and then I essentially re-enable it, okay? Again, when you uninstall it and change code and reinstall Blender, sometimes it's just best to restart it. But if I do the test, whatever I called it, this guy here, if I check for update now, you would see it says something else. It says update now to version 3.0 whatever. If I choose reinstall version, you can see in this repository I have a lot more different versions, and they also are slightly formatted different. It doesn't have a V in front of it, it's just the straight number. Because again, it just directly matches what's online. So when it comes to implementing your code into your add-ons, one useful thing that would be important to know is that for this reinstall version, you can limit the versions people install. So for example, if you implemented the add-on updater into version 2.0, you don't want people to accidentally revert to version 1.9 because then they don't have the updated code anymore. Then they'll be stuck like, what did I do? I can't go back. So we do have the ability to do that. So if I jump back into the code and go to the ops file, you will see that there is a line item for a minimum version update and a max version update. And so again, using this repository as an example, we saw how it goes from 3.0 and onwards. Let's say I want to make it not go below 2.1.2. So all I have to do is do 2.1.2. And again, it's a minimum equal to or larger than version. And just for also proving this sake, let's say I don't want users to update to version 3.0 because I know something's going to change, or it's not going to be compatible, or maybe this is a paid add-on and I want them to pay for an update, whatever it could be. So I want to limit to make it sure that they don't update to that version. So if I were to now essentially install this guy again, so we're going to compress, going to just again fully remove the add-on, then reinstall it and restart Blender. Just real quick here. And then go to my test add-on file. If I now check for update, again, it says you can update to version 2.1.3. So it doesn't show version 3.0. And if we look at the install old versions, we only have the two options because that's what we specified in our target. So this is all really great. Now I'm going to close this out with one very, very last thing. So at this point, we have not actually implemented the code that does the auto checking. So right now, if I check this box and save it, it's not going to do anything. You're not going to have auto checking. You actually have to place one more piece of code wherever it may be appropriate. And that piece of code essentially draws the background for doing the update. So the way we do this is we need to find a panel where we want to trigger this code. And so the logic is that you don't want to automatically check for an update unless you're already drawing the panel for the add-on anyway. So for example, if the user's not interacting with your add-on, maybe it's not so convenient to have it's taking processing time and checking for an update. Or if you have too many add-ons installed at the same time that are all checking for updates because you just open Blender, again, not so convenient. So the structure is that when the panel is drawn for your add-on, it can do this background check. It starts a background thread, it does a check, and then when it finishes the check, it will reconnect back to the interface and do the pop-up. So the reason when we first opened Blender, the demo panel worked right away is because this panel was in the T menu, which was being displayed here. So I know I'm kind of up at my time here, but essentially, I'll say it's enough to say that essentially all you have to do is again, this is all in the tutorial on the repository itself. If you just go, it's this step 8. All you have to really do is copy this line of code into any panel you want where you want to do the check for the update. And in the same panel, you can also draw this little piece of code here, which is an in-panel notice saying, hey, there's an update, and it gives you the buttons to directly update there or not. So that's essentially the add-on updater. I guess that's also my time. Again, if you want to implement this in your code, all you have to do is go to, not my channel, but here we go. It's github.com/CGCookie/blender-addon-updater. And if you try it out, we're happy to hear who else is using it. It's being used by a lot of people already. It's really great. It's used by Retopoflow, Gaffer. It's even used by Crowdmaster, which is going to be demoed later on in this Blender World Meetup Day. If you run into issues, please do open issues here. This is being actively developed and supported. A lot of things right now are sort of enhancements, but if you come across issues, let us know. And this is something for the community. It's hopefully going to solve some problems, and so we're happy to collaborate and make this better. All right, David, thank you for the time. Yeah, go for it. The most common thing that people forget to do, honestly, is in this ops file. Remember, I took like a minute to say this. Make sure you change this here. Make sure you change the line 44 or whatever it is. Set your add-on so that, again, this is what defines your BL ID name for all of your classes. if you forget to set this, it will clash with the rest of any other add-on that you have installed that uses this. So again, that's very important. I want to say the other one, it's like, what's the most common? It kind of varies. I mean, the steps are, pretty straightforward. I know sometimes people have different structures for how they register, but make sure that when you register it, don't forget you're passing in the BL info. And then the other one is, this is pretty common as well, is when, I was just talking about that last step. If you have like your user preferences defined in a different file, or you're trying to, do this pop-up, the panel thing, if that's in a different file, just remember that whatever file you want to use the code or launch code from the updater, don't forget to do this import here. It's from.import Addon updater ops. I would say those are the most common issues that people run into. Yeah. Perfect. I certainly can do that. Yep. And so it is github.com/cgcookie/blender-addon-updater. Yep, and if anyone wants to message me, I'll be on the chat a little bit. But you can also reach me at Twitter, or my website is theduckhow.com. That's where the tutorial is hosted as well. So that's a few different avenues that you can get at me through. Or again, just open up an issue if it's an issue. I guess don't chat to me through issues. That would not be good. But otherwise, yeah, thank you for the time. And I hope some developers implement this into the code. And I'm happy to support anyone who runs into issues.